From arrogance to distraction. This week's study brings us to chapter 5 in the book of Daniel, where we become witnesses of the fall and the destruction of the great Babylonian Empire. Who brought it down and how did this happen?
Last week, the path in the lesson was from pride to humility. But this week, the direction is different, from arrogance to destruction. And I wonder how much is the difference between pride and arrogance to lead to so different and dramatic results.
It is believed that King Belshazzar was the grandson of King Nebuchadnezzar. So if King Nebuchadnezzar was the one who brought the sacred vessels from the temple in Jerusalem to Babylon with some degree of respect and sacredness, then King Belshazzar was the one who fully and completely desecrated them by turning them into drinking utensils. Hence, this was his last royal feast. Daniel's records tells us also that the lords or the nobles in the royal court praised the gods of the gold and the silver, the bronze and the iron, and the wood and the stone. So this comes to show that there was a spiritual element to this act of drinking from the Jehovah's sacred vessels. It wasn't just a simple act of ignorance only. In the lesson, the author's opinion is that this provocation, it was not only a challenge of God, but it was an attack to God, on God himself.
Babylon in the Bible has become a symbol for such arrogance. It starts with some pride and enjoyment of our success, but we can easily get out of touch, especially when we taste power. It makes you feel like God, but instead to nurture some sense of responsibility and humility, it gets so self-centered and a powerful drug and alcohol. It gets you drunk and high, and there is nothing rational left.
The lavish feast continued until late at night, until the appearance of a hand writing on the wall interrupted the whole celebration. And the king's face, we read, turned pale. And he was so frightened and his legs became weak. He was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. This exact record here tells me that either the king had some kind of a knowledge or some kind of a feeling what was going to happen next. It provoked in him fear, anxiety, and probably even horror of some sort. An interesting fact was that what was written on the wall was in Aramaic language. However, nobody whosoever was there could have understood what that meant. So determined to get some answers, King Belshazzar promised everything that he could have promised, even the first position after him in the kingdom, to those who can bring and uncover the meaning of the words. And how ironic. He was left with nothing that same night, but still promising everything. In my books, this was an act of desperation.
How much does it take to make the one challenging and insulting God a moment ago to tremble, turn pale, and have his knees knocking? A hand writing on a wall and few words that seem readable, and you know that they say something hugely important, but you can't make sense out of it. Human arrogance is so fragile and hopeless. To be able to understand a spiritual message with such divine origin, one needs not only to know how to read and to be fluent in science and knowledge, but to have a different disposition and openness.
And finally, it's the queen's advice that is brought forward as a solution, as a way out of this crisis. She's deeply disturbed and worried by the expression of her husband's face, pale and terrified. And she says, "There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him." This was good news, but also at the same time it was bad news, because whenever Daniel appeared in front of a Babylonian king, he was always able to uncover the mystery message there. However, it was always a humbling message, and it's not what the king always wanted to hear. In fact, what Daniel told King Belshazzar in verses 70 to 28 felt like a slap in the face. First, he refused to receive any gifts in exchange of providing the meaning of the words. And secondly, he accused the king Belshazzar in setting himself up against the Lord of heaven by drinking from the sacred vessels and by refusing to humble himself before God, something that his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar did and he knew well. Oh, and after Daniel deciphers the meaning of the words on the wall, the king realizes that his fate is already sealed.
Why was Belshazzar ignoring Daniel? I can't imagine that he didn't know about him. I'm sure he knew about his grandfather's stories. So, was he afraid to have anything to do with it? Was he just plain stupid and arrogant right from the beginning? I have no idea. But there on the wall was his judgment. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Paris, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians.
Babylon falls into the hands of the Medo-Persian army exactly as it was announced by the prophet and predicted by the prophet, and the king is slain. What really strikes my mind is how is it possible that somebody who's that powerful, somebody who's that rich can lose everything so suddenly? And it's never by chance. There is always a good reason, as we see behind it. And I would suggest that King Belshazzar had his chances of knowing God, had his chances of learning the ways of the God who's the creator of this world. I would also suggest that probably his ego and self-glorification without any limits overpowered his weak attempts to humble himself. Where in contrast to King Belshazzar, we have Daniel, who always stood strong and firm, but in the strength and in the wisdom of his God. One was a humble builder of character, community, society. The other one was an arrogant destroyer of everything that was entrusted to him under his authority.
This is the sad story of our human reality. Walking the thin line between pride and arrogance without the connection with God, without our dependence on God. And instead of finding pride in being instruments for amazing and glorious things, we make it about ourselves. And it quickly turns into arrogance and leads to destruction.
So join us again next week to continue with the lesson from the lion's den to the angel's den.